Hello everyone, welcome to this afternoon's GCSE Biology session. Great to see lots and lots of you joining us already. I am going to be joined by the lovely tutor Charlotte, who has been doing all of our biology sessions so far. So if you aren't new to the online school, then you'll know lots about Charlotte. If you are new to the My Tutor online school, welcome. It's really good to see you here. And this session will be on communicable diseases, as you can see. Charlotte, our tutor, studied conservation and biodiversity at Exeter University and has done over 150 lessons with my tutor. And she's also been leading all of the online tuition sessions for biology so far. So great to have Charlotte back with us again. Just to say from me that it's an hour session with 45 minutes of Charlotte delivering all of the lesson content for you, and then 15 minutes at the end for questions. And the best way for you to send questions through is either by using the chat function or by using the Q&A function, and either myself or Charlotte will pick up questions as they come in. That's everything from me for now, and I'll hand over to Charlotte now to lead the session.
Perfect. Hi everyone. So today we're looking at communicable diseases, which follows on nicely from last session, which was non-communicable diseases. So if you were here for that, this is kind of building on your knowledge of that and keeping going with infection and response, which is the sort of topic that we're working on at the moment. If you didn't join, then don't worry. This is, I try to coordinate these lessons so that it's kind of a something that you can learn in one go, so you haven't missed out too much. So today we're going to look at different types of communicable disease. So we're going to look at different types of pathogen and the kind of examples of diseases that they cause. So what we'll do is we'll go in kind of small sections at a time, and I'll try and stop for questions fairly regularly so we don't get too kind of carried away. Okay, so last time we talked about non-communicable diseases, which are diseases that aren't passed between people and organisms. And this session we're going to look at communicable diseases, so diseases that can be transferred between organisms and they're caused by pathogens. What do we mean when we say pathogen? Well, a pathogen is a microorganism that causes disease. So they infect a host, they reproduce or they replicate and make lots of copies of themselves, and then they spread to other organisms. That's what they're really good at doing. Not all microorganisms are pathogens. So there's lots of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that don't cause any harm at all, but those that do cause disease are called pathogens. We'll talk more about different types of pathogens as we go on today. How are pathogens spread? By transmission. So transmission is a key word here. So that means spreading between people. So pathogens can be transmitted by direct contact, so shaking hands. A lot of the things that we're being prevented from doing at the moment are to do with preventing the pathogen, the virus that is causing coronavirus. By water, so there are some diseases such as cholera that are spread by dirty water. Air, so that can be through the air itself or through water droplets that pass through air. So for example, sneezing on someone when you have a cold passes the cold virus on through the droplets in the air. Unhygienic food preparation is another one. Very easy to pass on germs if you're not being hygienic in the kitchen. And also vectors. The vectors tend to be slightly less common and are usually things that are more difficult to learn about. So a vector is a organism that carries a pathogen. So it transmits a pathogen between, say, humans, but it doesn't get the disease itself, so it just carries it. So we've got this diagram here, which kind of demonstrates that a bit more. So we've got direct contact by shaking hands, by air, by indirect contact, which we didn't really talk about. So if I touch a mug of or a cup of water and then I give it to someone else to have a sip, that would be indirect contact. So they haven't had direct contact with me, but they've had contact with something that I've touched. By food, we talked about, or here we've got mosquitoes or rabid animals as examples of vectors. I'm going to talk about more about those later on as well. Okay, so we're going to start with viruses. So there are 4 different types of pathogen: bacteria, virus, fungi, and protists. We're going to work through each one of those in this session. We're going to start with viruses. So we'll run through this and then we'll stop for quick questions about viruses. Okay, so what is a virus? This is actually, it's quite a difficult question to answer because viruses are slightly strange organisms. They're not alive. They can't be treated by antibiotics. They can survive outside a host for a long time. Essentially, they're genetic material surrounded by a protein coat and attachment proteins for invading cells. So you can see on this diagram here, we've got our DNA in the middle. It can be DNA or RNA in viruses. Usually it's DNA. And then they have this protein coat surrounding them, which is called a capsid. That helps to protect them and give them some structure. And then they have these attachment proteins for invading cells. So viruses infect their host, and then they replicate their DNA and their protein coats inside the cell of their host. That then allows them to kind of build new copies of themselves. And then the host cell bursts and nearby cells are infected. It's a very neat, very quick replication processes for viruses because they don't breed like bacteria as such. They replicate themselves rather than reproducing, so they just produce copies. They can't be treated by antibiotics. The reason for that is that because they're within a cell and antibiotics target foreign cells, antibiotics don't detect a virus usually, and antibiotics are for bacteria and viruses aren't bacteria. So examples of viral diseases, we're going to start with tobacco mosaic virus in plants. Tobacco mosaic virus infects tobacco plants in particular, but also other related plants such as tomatoes and peppers. It's transmitted by direct contact between the plants or indirect contact through the hands of farmers as they're moving around tending their crops. How does it affect its host? Well, you can see here, it affects the chloroplasts of the plant. So if you were in our plant organisation session, then we talked about how chloroplasts are where photosynthesis takes place in the plant. And tobacco mosaic virus targets that area of the plant. It changes the colour from green to white or yellow, like this section of the leaf that you can see there. It reduces photosynthesis because there's not as much chlorophyll in the chloroplasts, so it's not able to absorb the sun and the sunlight and get energy through that for photosynthesis. And so that affects the plant's ability to grow properly. And so there's less yield for the farmers. How is it cured? There's no direct cure. Viruses are very difficult to cure directly, as we're finding at the moment. Farmers can only try to reduce the spread of disease or infection in the crop. So things that you can do to reduce spread of disease or infection are things like distancing between subjects that we're practicing at the moment, and also making sure that farmers sort of wear gloves and don't pass things on between the plants. So that's an example in plants. Here's an example of a virus in humans. So HIV and AIDS are very severe diseases in humans. So we'll learn more about them now. HIV and AIDS affect humans. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. So it affects humans. Immunodeficiency tells us that it affects the immune system and it is a virus. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. So AIDS is a syndrome of immune compromisation, I suppose. The immune system is compromised and can't function as it normally would to throw off other diseases. How is it transmitted? HIV is transmitted through body fluids. So it's often transmitted through unprotected sex, transmitted through cuts, or also through sharing needles, usually drug taking. So one of the big reasons that in medicine you always use one needle per person, you only use one needle at a time, and then they, if you've ever had an injection in the doctors, they put the head of the needle straight into the sharps bin. That's to avoid transmitting infections like HIV. How does it affect the host? So immediately after infection, patients have mild flu-like symptoms that usually pass. So you think you've got a bit of a cold. And so often the patient doesn't know that they're infected. And that's why HIV is so difficult to control and to cure, because by the time you realise that you've got it, it's usually too late. Because months later, HIV becomes active and attacks the immune system. And at that point, the HIV has become AIDS. So it's become acquired immune deficiency syndrome, because you've acquired that attack on your immune system. If your immune system is compromised, you're much more vulnerable to things like pneumonia or flu or other pathogens that are easily caught. So we talked on Tuesday a little bit about interactions between diseases, whether having one disease can make it worse for getting another one. And this is a prime example of that. So if you have HIV, then you are much more prone, or AIDS, you're much more prone to getting diseases such as pneumonia, because your immune system is compromised. How is it cured? At the moment, there's no cure, but patients can be given antiviral drugs that slow down the disease. So rather than being a direct fatality, you can manage the symptoms and slow it down. You can see a diagram of HIV there, so looking at a virus structure again. So it's got its genetic material in the middle there, got a protein coat or capsid around it, and then proteins that help it enter host cells. Finally, we've got one other viral disease, which is measles in humans. So measles is also caused by a virus. It affects humans, particularly young children. And it's transmitted through the air in tiny droplets after someone sneezes, a bit like colds. Colds are also viral diseases. How does it affect the host? Well, hopefully you'll know a little bit about measles. So you get fever and a skin rash, so lots and lots of little red dots. If caught by adults, the disease can have more serious complications, such as infertility. So it tends to be something that's caught by children and can be managed, but usually if caught by adults, it's much more serious. How is it cured? So in many countries, children are given a vaccine against the disease. That's certainly what we do in the UK. When we're very young, we're offered the vaccination for measles, as well as two other diseases called mumps and rubella, the MMR vaccine. But it's not the case in some places, in which case children will often be infected by the disease and hopefully would be able to recover from that and not then catch it as adults, because then they would have some immunity to it. Okay, I think that's it for viruses for now. Do we have any particular questions about viruses? If you pop them in the question and answer, and then I can have a quick look at those for a couple of minutes before we move on. Got one here, what is RNA? So you learn more about RNA in A-level. So this is a little bit above some of the GCSE topics. So DNA, we know, is the genetic material that we find in a nucleus in our cells. Someone's saying, can we go back to the what is the virus slide? So I've done that. So DNA is 2 strands formed in a helix, and RNA is another form of genetic material that's just a single strand. So it's used in some organisms like viruses, and you'll learn more about that at A-level if you continue with biology to A-level. But for now, think of viruses as having genetic material in the middle, and then a protein coat, and then those attachment proteins on the outside. If viruses aren't alive, how do they mutate? So they still have genetic material, so they can still have mutations in their genetic material. Difference between virus and disease. So virus is the thing that causes the disease. So the virus is the pathogen, and the disease is, I suppose, the symptoms or the condition, like measles. That would be the disease. Are colds and coronavirus communicable diseases? Yes, they are. Colds, obviously, you know, we all get colds a couple of times a year. They're caused by a virus. We're normally pretty well either immune to them, or we tend to get over them quite quickly. And coronavirus is fairly new, so we're still working out how to get around that. They're working on a vaccine at the moment, as far as I hear in the news. Is it more likely to recover from HIV or AIDS? So HIV and AIDS are kind of, I see what you mean. Okay, so if you're infected with HIV and you realise before it's turned to AIDS, then there is treatments that you can go through. We won't go into them in detail. You do tend to go through them more in A-level. But yes, if you catch it early, it's better. Okay, let's move on to bacteria. What are bacteria? So bacteria we've learned about in cell biology. So bacteria are prokaryotes. So they don't have a nucleus. They are small in size. They tend to have a capsule. Their genetic material tends to be free in the cytoplasm, or you may have little circles of genetic material called plasmids. Bacteria are everywhere. Not all of them are pathogens. Some, such as our gut bacteria, are useful to us for things like digesting our food. But bacteria that cause disease can be described as pathogens. So an example of a bacterial disease. So our first example is gonorrhea. Gonorrhea, again, is a human disease. It's common in young adults, and it's an STD. So it's a sexually transmitted disease. It affects the host. It's pretty unpleasant. So you can have discharge from the infected person's penis or vagina and pain when urinating. And if untreated, it can lead to infertility. So it's quite aggressive. It can be prevented by abstinence, so not having sex, or using protections such as condoms. And it can also be treated by antibiotics. So if you realise that you've got it, you can cure it fairly quickly and fairly easily. There's a diagram there of the bacteria itself, so that's a funny looking thing. Okay, then we have another human bacterial disease caused by Salmonella, which is another bacteria. Again, this infects humans, and it's transmitted through food being prepared in an unhygienic kitchen, or undercooking food, or food not being reheated properly. So salmonella is more commonly known as food poisoning. How does it affect the host? Stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. If you've ever had food poisoning, it's very unpleasant, but it does tend to pass quite quickly. How is it cured? So it normally passes quickly, or it can be prevented by cooking the food properly in hygienic conditions. That's why it's really important to always wipe down work surfaces in the kitchen, and to make sure that everything you use is washed properly. You can also vaccinate poultry, who are often the source of the bacteria. So salmonella is most often found in chicken or in eggs, and normally we do vaccinate poultry for that now. So it's particularly important to make sure that you cook chicken properly. We all know that we can't eat pink chicken. And also to cook eggs properly if you're cooking eggs, because they are the foods that are particularly susceptible to carrying salmonella bacteria. Okay, that's all we have for bacteria, only 2 examples there, so salmonella and gonorrhea. Any questions about bacteria? Oh, we've got a couple. Are the majority of bacteria helpful? Yes, or at least the majority are helpful or don't affect us at all. It is a minority of bacteria that can act as pathogens. Back to the first slide on bacteria, here we are. Okay, I think that's most of the questions about bacteria. I'll give it a second just in case you have got another one, and then we'll move on to the next type of pathogen that we're going to talk about. We've got, someone's saying, can you repeat the answer to the helpful bacteria question? So most bacteria are either helpful or they don't affect us at all. They're just there, they'll be affecting something else or going about their life cycles. So it is a minority of bacteria that act as pathogens and cause disease. Can you cure salmonella? It's more you can prevent salmonella rather than curing it. It will cure itself. So when you get food poisoning, you will be well again. It's not like HIV or AIDS that may kill you, and you do tend to be infected for life. Salmonella is something a bit like a cold that we get over. It's very unpleasant, but it's short, sharp, and then you become well again. So it's more about preventing it. So making sure that we cook our food properly, reheat it properly, and prepare it in a hygienic way. Okay, let's move on to protists. Back through salmonella there. What is a protist? So this is our 3rd type of pathogen. We've talked about viruses, we've talked about bacteria, now we're going to talk about protists. Most people haven't heard of protists. They are a very strange class of organism. They have features that belong to plants, animals, and fungi. They're all eukaryotic, so they're not bacteria. They all have a nucleus. But the best I could do for finding a diagram for you was this lovely Venn diagram that sort of shows you that they're a bit of everything, really. They're a bit of all eukaryotes. And even when I tried to find a diagram of one, they look so different that I couldn't find sort of a way of showing you what a protist looked like. They are odd things. But for now, we need to know that a protist is a type of organism that can be a pathogen and cause disease. And they're eukaryotic, so they are cells, or they are made up of cells, and they do have a nucleus, and they can have other features from different types of animals as well. So some of them have chloroplasts and photosynthesize. Some of them are like animal cells and just have, you know, your usual organelles for protein synthesis, so ribosomes, or mitochondria for respiration. And some of them have fungal kind of characteristics as well. We're going to do fungi next, so we won't go into them now. Okay, so the first and the only protist disease that we're going to talk about today is malaria. Malaria is a disease that you normally get in hot countries. It's caused by a protist, so one of those funny organisms that we just talked about, and the protist is called Plasmodium. So that's the specific name of the protist itself. Normally in hot countries such as those in Africa or South America. The reason for that is because it's transmitted via a vector, the mosquito. So they carry malaria, but they're not affected themselves. It's very simple. The mosquito bites someone that has malaria, and then they move on to someone else to bite them, and they pass it on to the next person through the blood that they're sucking out and then sucking from someone else. How does it affect the host? The infected person has fever, sweats and chills, headache, vomiting, and diarrhea. These are pretty aggressive symptoms, and it can be fatal, usually because of the symptoms that are caused by the disease. So lots of vomiting and diarrhea, you become very, very dehydrated, and therefore if you can't get enough fluids into you, it can be fatal. There's no cure as such, but again, we can prevent the disease. So if you're going to some of these hot countries, you're usually advised to stop mosquitoes biting you by sleeping under nets, wearing insect repellent, and taking anti-malarial drugs. They treat the symptoms of malaria, and they may also help prevent infection in the first place, so they're well worth taking. So that's malaria. Okay, any questions about protists before we move on to our last section, fungi? Oh, good one there. Do mosquitoes and vaccines contaminate diseases similarly? In short, no. So a mosquito, I see what you mean, because a mosquito's, I suppose, mouth, I can't remember the technical term for a mosquito's, the needle-like thing that it ejects into you to then bite you and suck your blood. That doesn't work in the same way as a vaccine. So we're going to talk about vaccines next week. So you'll get a better idea of that then if you tune into that session. But the mosquito's mouth, just by going under the skin and going into the bloodstream, means that it can carry that protist. And then when it sticks its mouth into the next person to bite it, it can pass it on. So it's almost like indirect contact. Are there other protista? Yes, lots and lots of protists. So then again, they're not always pathogens. They don't always cause disease. There are lots of them around. So usually protists are just there in our environment. They don't always cause disease, same as bacteria and fungi and viruses as well. A lot of them are just there. But when they do cause disease, we describe them as pathogens. Okay, let's move on to fungi. So what are fungi? So fungi are eukaryotes as well. So we talked about that. They have a nucleus that contains their genetic material, unlike prokaryotes, like bacteria. Some fungi are single-celled. plants, they only have one cell for the whole organism, but some are multicellular, e.g. mushrooms are a fungus. They have lots of cells. Not all fungi are pathogens, some are useful, e.g. the yeast that we put in bread. We use that for making bread, that's a fungus, and that's very helpful, produces the food that we eat. But again, if the fungus causes a disease, we describe it as a pathogen. So there's a diagram here of a fungus, of a cell from a fungus. It's quite similar looking really to an animal cell. So it's got a nucleus with its genetic material in it. It's got a vacuole, that's a bit more like a plant cell. It's got a cytoplasm, as all cells do, surface membrane, and this one does have a cell wall as well. Whereas in a plant, the cell wall is made of cellulose, here it's made of chitin. Okay. A fungal disease here, athlete's foot. Don't know how many of you have had athlete's foot. It doesn't look very nice. It looks a bit like that picture there. So it's normally on our feet, and it does infect humans. It's transmitted directly, so direct contact with infected skin or indirect contact through surfaces, e.g. at the swimming pool when we all walk around with bare feet. A bit like verrucas as well. How does it affect the host? It causes dry, flaky, red or white skin, which is often cracked, usually itchy, often between the toes. It becomes quite swollen, it's very itchy, and it feels wrong, I suppose. And it can be cured by antifungal medication. So we talked about how antibiotics can be used for bacteria, but not for viruses. So antibiotics can't be used for diseases that are caused by funguses either. They are designed for bacteria. However, we do have antifungal medication. And antifungal medication normally targets the cell walls of fungi because they're made of that specific material called chitin that we saw in that last diagram. And we've got another plant example. So I feel like we've talked about a lot of human examples of diseases today. So one fungus that can affect plants is rose black spot in plants, rose black spot fungus. It only affects rose plants, and it's transmitted in air or water or direct contact with gardeners as well. So it can be transmitted in quite a few different ways. It's very good at moving between plants. So it infects the leaves of the rose plant, and it causes black or purple spots. See them there? That kills the leaves, so they drop off, and it blocks the chloroplasts in the leaf, so they can't absorb light energy from the sun and photosynthesize as they normally would. So the plant can't grow and function as it would like to. Again, can it be cured? So gardeners can use fungicides to kill the fungus. So when you're gardening or farming crops, or if you are producing fruit or anything like that, you quite often use sprays, pesticides, to target different pathogens of the plant. So in this case, you could use a fungicide to kill the fungus and stop your plants being infected by rose black spot. You can also remove and destroy infected leaves to try and stop the fungus moving between leaves on the plant and transmitting quite so quickly. Okay, that is everything for today. So Any more questions about fungi? And then we'll move on and do some past paper questions so you can see how this will apply in exams. Could you isolate the person who has malaria? Really good question. Yes, you can, and that would be an effective way of helping to stop transmission, because if nothing else, you would hope that any mosquitoes that bit them might not get to anyone else if they were isolated, but you would have to isolate them in a way that stopped mosquitoes getting to them at all. So it would be quite difficult. And of course, to be treated, someone would need to go in, like our nurses and doctors are doing at the moment, to treat patients that have the disease. So there's obviously a risk of transmission there. But obviously malaria isn't spread by direct contact. It's definitely all about those mosquitoes. So if you can exclude mosquitoes from at least that room in the hospital, then that would be a help. And that would mean that a mosquito couldn't bite that infected person and then take it on to someone else. Okay, funguses, fungi. So I was saying, please take off that picture of feet. So if we go back to this diagram of a fungi, what's the difference between a vacuole and the cytoplasm? So all plant cells have a vacuole. A vacuole is filled with something, usually cell sap, we call it, and it's there for the structure of the cell. So it's just filled with sap and it just holds the cell in a certain structure, so stops it collapsing in on itself. Keeps the cell turgid, we say, for plant cells. Whereas the cytoplasm is a bit like the plasma in our blood. It's kind of the medium where everything else happens. So the cytoplasm is where all the other organelles are located. It's where a lot of the chemical reactions take place in a cell. It's full of enzymes, it's full of proteins, all of those different things. So they are very different organelles. How can you avoid athlete's foot, or can it be anywhere in pools and there's nothing you can do to stop getting it? So athlete's foot, I feel like I made a bit of an impression with that picture. Sorry, it was a bit gross. It's not everywhere at the swimming pool. If you go to a swimming pool, you are not automatically going to get athlete's foot or a verruca. Those are two different diseases, but they are, you're not guaranteed to get them. The best thing to do to stop getting it is hope that the people that have got it don't go barefoot to the swimming pool. That's the first rule. If you ever get athlete's foot or a verruca, you don't go barefoot to the swimming pool. And you can also make sure that your feet stay nice and dry and clean most of the time. So if you spend a long time with hot, damp, sweaty feet, that's a really good environment for bacteria and fungi to grow in. So it's best to make sure that wash your feet well in the shower, and make sure that you're not in really hot, sweaty socks all day. When you've been out for a run, make sure that you have a shower, make sure you wash your feet, wash the socks, that sort of thing. So it's fairly easy to prevent. We don't all get it. Is coronavirus eukaryote? No, coronavirus is a virus. So it's a viral disease. Viruses are kind of a school of their own. They're not really eukaryotic or prokaryotic. They don't really have a nucleus, but they're not bacteria either. Pesticides, what you would spray to get rid of fungi. You would spray a particular type of pesticide to get rid of that particular plant fungus. So pesticides covers a whole range of products that you can use on crops or plants in your garden to help with different plant diseases. And plant diseases can be caused by bacteria or viruses or fungi as well. So there's a whole different range of products for those. Are there fatal fungal diseases that affect humans? Yes. trying to think of a particular example, and I can't think of the name of one. There are some pretty horrible fungal diseases that can affect lungs. So they can be fatal. Most of these diseases that we're talking about now aren't usually fatal. You have to be a bit unlucky, a bit like with coronavirus, where it's only if you get a really bad form of coronavirus that you experience those really awful symptoms that we've been hearing about, with really struggling to breathe, really affecting lungs. So most diseases are a bit like that, where you can be affected quite badly because of any combination of, you know, your genetic makeup, the lifestyle that you have at the moment. Have you already had a disease? Is your immune system not quite up to throwing something off? So most diseases aren't fatal. You have to be quite unlucky or catch it quite late. How does a plant get rose black spots? So it would get, let's move to that slide. So it can get rose black spot fungus by, so the fungus can travel by air or water. So that could be if you have managed to get some in your watering can and then you water 5 different roses, you could then transmit it to all 5 of them. Or it can be through direct contact with gardeners. So if you picked off a leaf with black spots or rose black spot fungus and then threw away that leaf but didn't change your gloves or wash your hands before touching the next rose plant, then you could transmit that fungus to the next one. If you keep your feet completely dry, does that mean there's no chance of you getting a verruca or athlete's foot? No, it doesn't. Again, we don't usually get them. So you don't need to worry too much. Just stay clean. Make sure that you air your feet out once or twice a day, so they're not in hot, sweaty socks all the time, and you'll be fine. Does athlete's foot only affect feet? That's a really good question. It doesn't. It's normally in feet. Occasionally you can get cases of it being on hands, but normally it's in feet. Okay. Keep putting up questions, but we are going to have a look at some past paper questions, I think, and show you what sort of questions you might see in an exam. Okay, so question 1, microorganisms can cause disease. Okay, so when we're doing a question, we always underline keywords. Make sure that we've read the question properly. Microorganisms can cause disease. We've learned today that not all microorganisms cause disease. Those that do, we call pathogens. Draw one line from each disease to the correct description. So we've got HIV, malaria, and salmonella. We've talked about all of those today. Then the descriptions are: can be spread by not washing hands thoroughly, can increase the chance of infections such as pneumonia, part of the life cycle includes an insect, spread by coughs and sneezes, treated with stem cells, or treated with fungicides. Okay, so we learnt today that HIV, when it affects you, it affects your immune system, and so HIV increases the chance of infection such as pneumonia. Malaria, we talked about, is caused by a protist and spread by a vector called a mosquito. And salmonella can be spread by not washing hands thoroughly. So that would be talking about your hygienic preparation in the kitchen, making sure that you wash your hands, and it's a bacterial disease, so it can be spread by your hands as well as in that uncooked food that we talked about. Okay, 3 marks for that question. We drew 3 lines. So we earn each one of those. Okay, part B. Gonorrhea is a sexually transmitted disease. It's caused by a bacteria. What are the symptoms of gonorrhea? We talked about these as well. Talked about pain when urinating and a discharge as well. 2 marks for that one. Okay, gonorrhea is treated with an antibiotic. HIV is another sexually transmitted disease. We learned about HIV. Explain why prescribing an antibiotic will not cure HIV. So we did talk about this. HIV is a virus. Viruses cannot be treated by antibiotics. HIV is a virus and antibiotics are only effective against bacteria. For a bit of kind of higher level stuff, again, do a bit more of this at A level. I know some of you are looking to make the transition to A level biology. So HIV is a virus. Antibiotics are only effective against bacteria, mostly because bacteria exist kind of between our cells, whereas viruses hide themselves within our own cells. So we can't treat them without destroying our own cells. Antibiotics can't do that. Okay. Some infections are caused by bacteria. We learned that today as well. The genetic material is arranged differently in the cells of bacteria compared with animal and plant cells. Describe 2 differences. So I thought this was a really good question because a lot of what we've learned today has been quite specific to diseases, but thinking about these microorganisms themselves, we need to think about the differences between them. Bacteria are prokaryotic, and one of the first things that we cover in cell biology and GCSE is the difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So this should be familiar. 2 marks. Prokaryotic cells only have 1 strand of DNA. The DNA is circular. It's not in, oh, I spelt that wrong. Should be DNA rather than Dan. It's not in a nucleus, whereas in our eukaryotic cells, in our animal, plant cells, and fungi cells, and protist cells, they all have a nucleus that contains that DNA. Bacteria may also have those circular bits of DNA called plasmids. Okay, so nice final question here involving some data. It's always good to learn to interpret data in tables or in graphs. So I usually try to include one of these. So tuberculosis is an infection caused by bacteria. We didn't learn about tuberculosis today, but you don't need specific knowledge of the disease to answer the question. You might find that there's a question in an exam that approaches it like this. So it talks about a disease that you haven't heard before, introduces it, and asks you to think about similarities between that disease and other ones that you've heard of. So we know that tuberculosis is caused by bacteria. Table below shows the number of cases of TB in different regions of southern England from 2000 to 2011, so particularly in southern England. Cases of TB per 100,000 people. So before we move on to the question, which I put on the next slide anyway, let's have a look at this table. So we can see year down the side, going from 2000 to 2011. Then across here, we've got cases in London, South East, and the Southwest. So looking at the table in general, we don't need to pay too much attention, but just notice some trends. So there's always more cases in London, which kind of makes sense. London has more people in it than most places in the Southeast or the Southwest. And looking down the rows, there's maybe a slight increase from 2000 to 2011, 37 to 45 cases, but then there's a 49 in the middle there. If we look down this table, again, this kind of seems to stay fairly, maybe a slight increase towards the end. You've got more 3s and 4s at the beginning, more 6s and 5s towards as time's moved on. And the same here, the southeast has gone from 5 to 10, and fairly, you can see an increase there in the southeast. Okay, let's see what the question says. I've got 3 parts. Okay, so how does the number of cases of TB for London compare with the rest of southern England? 1 mark for this one. Well, we kind of answered that when we had our general look at the table, didn't we? So we said that London is much higher and more variable in its number of cases of TB. Part 2, describe the pattern in the data for cases of TB in the southeast. Again, we kind of did that. 1 mark there, so we only need to give a short answer. Cases increase. I would write this in a sentence in the exam. Here I haven't. I've just jotted down a quick note to myself to advise you how to answer, but I would always try to write in full sentences. But there's no reason that they shouldn't be full and short sentences. Describe the pattern in the data for cases of TB in the southwest. Now, when we were looking at the table, we kind of said, the southwest seems to differ a little bit. So overall, there is a slight increase, but it is variable and goes up and down. 2 marks for that answer. So you don't have to say anything particularly data heavy. You just need to be able to describe what you see in the data, and note the command word there for that question. It says describe. So you don't need to give an explanation, you just need to describe what you see. So there is a slight increase, but it is variable and goes up and down. Okay, have we got any more questions? Have a look. We've had lots of questions today.
Charlotte, it looks like we've had lots of questions on prevention things. So maybe if we could cover that. But then again, I think that might be in coming up in another session. So we've had someone ask, does athlete's foot only affect feet? Someone say, can you go to the first slide on bacteria, please?
So I'll go back to the bacteria slide. Oh, that's viruses. Here we are. So we are going to talk more about prevention of disease next week. So make sure that you tune in for that. There are lots of different ways that you can prevent diseases in general. And our bodies are well designed for preventing disease, which is why in general, we're quite healthy. So let's talk about that briefly, and we'll go through in more detail some of the more kind of clever methods for preventing disease next week. But our bodies, just from the outside, are very good at preventing disease. So, for example, our skin is a really good barrier for preventing pathogens getting into our blood, into the rest of our bodies. Our skin is really well designed for that, just by being skin. We also have other things in our bodies. So, for example, in our throats, we have mucus. We have more mucus when we have a cough or a cold, but we always have a little bit there, and that's designed to catch pathogens, so to catch bacteria and things when they come in and to get rid of them. That's why we cough. There's other things as well. So for example, our stomach is really acidic. That gets rid of a lot of nasty things just by being really acidic. It's impossible for a lot of things to live in our stomach. So even if you manage to swallow something that has some bad bacteria in it, or some fungi, or other things, then the stomach can get rid of a lot of that. Not all. Obviously, we still get food poisoning occasionally, so salmonella doesn't really respond to gut acidity. So yes, our bodies in general are designed to make sure that we don't get diseases. We're also going to talk about other things next week. So we're going to talk about vaccination, which we talked about briefly in this session for measles. We're going to talk more about that and how that works. We're also going to talk about our body's immune response. So apart from barriers to infection, like our skin and the mucus in our throats and the acid in our stomach, we've got lots of really good enzymes and proteins and things that help us to throw off pathogens and make sure that we don't get diseases. So we're going to talk more about that. In fact, we did touch on it slightly when we did transport systems and we talked about the blood. We talked about how we have red blood cells for transporting oxygen, and we also have white blood cells. And those white blood cells have the function of engulfing pathogens, so bacteria and other pathogens, and destroying them. And also of creating antibodies, which is something that we'll learn about more next week. So well worth coming to the session next week if you want to understand more about preventing disease. I understand it's quite a kind of topical topic at the moment with us all in isolation due to coronavirus. So well worth learning.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. I think that's probably a good place to leave it there, seeing as we've only have one or 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Just to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and this session has been recorded, and if you are signed up to the My Tutor Online School, then you'll be able to access the recordings afterwards, and to say keep your eye out for the timetable upload next week for the My Tutor Online School, as we've got a full plan of some subjects for you, like always. So thank you to Charlotte, and thank you for everyone for joining us. See you soon. Bye.
Bye everyone.